of Labor under President Clinton, supporter Bernie Sanders, author of Saving Capitalism for the Many, Not the Few. And Mr. Frank, let me begin with you. There were a few different answers given in that interview in the Daily News. There's a great degree of actual policy confusion about this. Your response first to what you heard from Senator Sanders about too big to fail, about breaking up the banks in that interview.
It was very disappointing because it wasn't coherent. He conflated several issues. By the way, I had understood previously that one of his biggest issues to deal with this was Glass-Steagall. I didn't see any reference to Glass-Steagall or explanation of that. He appeared to have forgotten all about this. And of course, Glass-Steagall is not relevant to the too big to fail issue. It has to do with other issues. But he confused several things. First, he was talking about antitrust, or not first, but then he was talking about not enough loans going to smaller banks. Look, the too big to fail issue was very specific. The problem is if an institution is capable of amassing so much debt that if it becomes insolvent and can't pay its debts, it causes systemic damage.
Yes.
That's what happened in 2008. The legislation deals with that in two ways, the bill that's on the books. First of all, it severely restricts their ability to incur debt. AIG owed $180 billion in credit default swaps it couldn't pay. You couldn't do that anymore. You have got to have capital both in general in the institution and specifically. In addition, what we say is this: if an institution is going to go out of business because it can't pay its debts, the federal government takes it over. It fails. That's the key thing people don't understand. An institution becomes too heavily indebted, is put out of business by the federal government. And if it has too much debt, and that level of debt threatens the stability of the economy, the federal government temporarily pays some of those debts, only as much as it needs to stop things from going out of control, and then takes it back automatically under an assessment on other large institutions. Nothing in what Senator Sanders said deals with that at all. He, as I said, confuses several different issues. Right. He seems to have forgotten that he was for Glass-Steagall, and he does not explain in any way how he's going to do it. He does say, and I've dealt with this before in some things, he says he wants to break up the banks, but he doesn't tell us how big is too big. There's a fundamental problem there. The argument is that you don't want a bank to get so indebted and
right.
have such debt that it threatens the economy. So you deal with that by breaking up the banks. But I still haven't heard, and I've asked several times for Senator Sanders, how big is too big? To what level, if he is going to reduce the size of the banks, and he hasn't told us how, to what level do we have to go to protect ourselves?
Okay, let me turn to you, Robert. There's a whole sort of array of issues here, right? There's whether the understanding of Dodd-Frank is accurate, whether the actual goal itself is warranted or necessary, and then this sort of meta question, I think, which is, do you feel the senator is adequately briefed, is adequately studied, read in on what is essentially one of the central policy issues of his campaign?
Well, first of all, Chris, this is a tempest in a teapot. I read the interview and I read the transcript, and what the senator said in response to a question about the Fed's authority, and not the authority of the president, the Fed's authority to break up the big banks, is that he did not know, and I can understand that because the Fed's authority is a little bit ambiguous
yes.
under various statutes. And then when it came to the president's authority, Senator Sanders was very specific and he was accurate. He said, well, the president can, through the Treasury Secretary, convene a group of regulators. It is the Financial Stability Oversight Board, and they can determine whether a bank is too risky. And he, in terms of Glass-Steagall, I mean, Senator Sanders has said throughout this campaign that Glass-Steagall needs to be resurrected. He cannot abide the fact that Senator Clinton does not want to resurrect Glass-Steagall because although Glass-Steagall would not have prevented the financial meltdown, it would have, at least in the eyes of many regulators, many observers, including Dan Tarullo at the Fed, it would have helped.
Right.
And so we need to resurrect Glass-Steagall, and the senator has said that repeatedly. I honestly, I think that this entire tempest is really a reflection of how well the senator is doing, and the mainstream press may be a little bit nervous, and certainly the establishment is a little bit worried.
Mr. Frank, you don't seem to agree with that.
No, I'm sorry that Mr. Reich is kind of, they're picking on poor Bernie, who has, of course, been hypercritical of others. And by the way, the thing that most bothered me in that interview and elsewhere in the campaign is of a kind of a McCarthyite suggestion that the reason big banks and other institutions haven't been criminally prosecuted is in part because people have taken financial contributions. And that, by the way, is an attack on President Obama. Let's be very clear. The Secretary of State does not get to indict people. So the complaint that there were not criminal prosecutions has literally zero to do with Secretary Clinton. It's an attack on President Obama. I wanted there to be more prosecutions. There were some policy choices I disagreed with. But Senator Sanders' consistent suggesting that somehow people were persuaded not to do that because of campaign contributions is, as I said, it's a kind of McCarthyism. It's an accusation without substance. Beyond that, no, I don't blame the press. I don't see how you can do that. That was a very good interview, and they did a very good job. And no, it is not the case that the president can convene a group of regulators. Hillary Clinton, by the way, has been very specific. There are some powers in the existing law to deal with banks if they are a serious threat. She, unlike Senator Sanders, has said specifically she wants to increase the power to deal with banks if there is a complexity that is getting out of control. But
well, there's already too much complexity, and they're already out of control. You know, in 2008, the biggest five biggest banks had 33% of total banking assets. Today, the 5 biggest banks have 44% of total biggest assets. And if they were too big to fail, then they're too big to fail. They're too big to jail. They're too big to curtail. They have too much political power as well as economic power. Well,
no,
now,
you
wait
misunderstand.
Political power is part of the issue.
It is not the size of the banks. It is the size of the indebtedness. Large institutions that are solidly capitalized, that don't have a lot of debt, it's the leverage. And that's the key thing. It's the amount of debt they leave behind.
Congressman Frank, with all due respect, I do respect you a great deal.
You don't like the point.
It's not just economics here. We're also talking about political power.
Okay, but I want to talk about economics. I understand that, but you don't like the economics because it goes against your argument. We'll get to the politics later.
No, the economics is exactly in my argument. They go together. The economics and the politics are intertwined here.
Mr. Reich, you don't want me to make the point about your economic mistake, and I understand that. It may be embarrassing, but the fact is this. The problem is not their size. It is the amount of indebtedness they leave behind and how you deal with that. And we deal with that by preventing them from getting excessively indebted as they were in the past. So it's very different than 2008. You could not have an AIG again. And we also say that if they do get too indebted, they fail. They are put out of business. Now, as to politics, I will say this. With regard to the political power, when we were dealing with the legislation, far more political power, frankly, is in the community banks, the credit unions, because they represent. I did not find when I was trying to get, for instance, the Consumer Bureau adopted, that it was the big banks that I had to worry about. I had to worry about the political power of the community banks, located as they are in everybody's district.
Let me just say this. The new head, the president of the Federal Reserve Bank in Minnesota, a Republican, a former Goldman Sachs executive, he says the big banks ought to be broken up. He's a Republican, former Goldman Sachs executive. He's now chairman. He's now president of the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis. Before him, the Federal Reserve Bank president in Dallas said the big banks have to be broken up. Sandy Weil thinks the big banks ought to be broken up. This is not a fringe idea.
I didn't say it was a fringe idea.
The big banks should be shrunk.
And what I'm saying is this, and you're evading my point again. If you believe the banks ought to be broken up, by the way, most of the federal officials do not think you have to break up the banks. We think we have to control their indebtedness. And that, again, is a point you seem to miss. But beyond that, if you tell me the banks are too big and have to be broken up, to what level? It is that we cannot allow an institution to exist if it's going out of business or its indebtedness will threaten us. I ask people to tell me to what level. Is it 500 billion? Is it 300 billion? All those have implications for the economy. Are we going to break up 12 banks? Are we going to break 10 banks into 8 pieces each? What's the level to which you want to reduce them?
If they are already too big to fail and curtail and jail. If they're too big to jail, if there's no way of controlling the big banks in this country, and there is not right now, they should be broken up right now. In my view, they should be broken up right now.
How big is too big?
They're too big right now.
But the question is a they, right? The question I think for anyone, right? Whether you're Bernie Sanders or anyone else, right, who's saying too big to fail should be broken up. I mean, there is right now a classification which is the systemically important financial institutions. That's a part of Dodd-Frank that essentially throws a lasso around the largest entities, the ones that have been deemed systemically vital, the ones that threaten the biggest risk. That's essentially the cutoff.
No,
They
let
don't
me
even,
respond.
the biggest bank, wait a minute, Chris. The biggest banks right now don't even have plans for winding themselves down in the event of a financial problem. They have the Fed and all of the oversight groups who are supposed to be looking at them have failed them on the basic principle of having a winding down plan. Now, if you don't even have a plan that passes muster, you ought to be put out of your misery.
Let me just stop you right there.
Let me respond to that, please, Crispy. First of all,
Very quickly,
there
please.
are two issues here. One is the level at which you get extra supervision. That's $50 billion. Nobody is suggesting, I think, that no bank be bigger than $50 billion. And again, the point is that what we want to do is to regulate them. As to the point Mr. Reich just made, yeah, we did require in the bill that they submit these plans, and under the law, it's working well. Some of them have been told those plans aren't good enough. But I want to repeat, it makes no sense. It's irresponsible to say we have to break them up. They're too big, and not tell
Barney
them
Frank,
this is
what
where
size you want to
politics
reduce
and
it.
economics
Mr. Frank,
come
Mr.
together.
Reich, Mr. Frank and Mr. Reich, I'm sorry. That was illuminating, deeply illuminating. We killed a break for it, but I now have to go. Thank you very much, both of you gentlemen, for joining us.
Thanks very
Appreciate it.
much.